What happens when a woman who has publicly shared her deepest grief, her struggles with weight, and her journey through 2 painful divorces sits down for what should be a friendly interview, only to have every wound reopened on live television? What you're about to witness is one of the most uncomfortable confrontations ever captured on daytime television. And the moment that followed left producers scrambling and an audience sitting in stunned silence. Valerie Bertinelli walked into the View studio that morning expecting to talk about healing. Instead, she found herself face to face with someone who seemed determined to make her bleed all over again. Before we dive into this explosive story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what you think about what happened. Because trust me, you're going to have strong feelings by the time this is over. The morning had started with such promise. Valerie Bertinelli arrived at the ABC studios 2 hours before her scheduled appearance, her usual warm smile greeting everyone from the security guards to the makeup artists. She was there to promote her latest cookbook, a deeply personal project filled with recipes that had helped her through the darkest period of her life. The book wasn't just about food. It was about survival. It was about finding small moments of peace in a kitchen when the rest of your world is falling apart. In the green room, she reviewed her talking points with her publicist. They had discussed the questions that might come up. Her weight loss journey. Her divorce from Tom Vital. The healing process after losing Eddie Van Halen. She was prepared to be open and vulnerable, because that's who Valerie Bertinelli had always been. Authentic. Real. Unafraid to show the messy parts of being human. Little did she know that her vulnerability was about to be weaponized against her. What she wasn't prepared for was an ambush disguised as an interview. The studio lights were hot as Valerie took her seat at the famous table. The audience was warm, giving her a standing ovation that brought genuine tears to her eyes. These were her people. Women who had grown up watching her on one day at a time, who had followed her journey through the decades, who saw themselves in her struggles and triumphs. They cheered not just for the actress they remembered, but for the woman they had come to know through her candid social media posts and her willingness to be real in a world that demanded perfection. Whoopi Goldberg opened the segment with characteristic warmth. We are so happy to have our next guest here today. She's been in our living rooms for nearly 50 years, from Barbara Cooper to her own cooking shows. Please welcome the incredible Valerie Bertinelli. The applause was thunderous. Valerie waved, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she'd brought from the green room. Thank you so much, she said, her voice catching slightly. It means so much to be here with all of you. I've watched this show for years, so this is a real honor. Sarah Haynes jumped in first with a question about the cookbook, and Valerie lit up talking about the recipes, the memories attached to each one, the way cooking had become her meditation during impossible times. She spoke about her grandmother's pasta sauce, how making it connected her to memories of being a child in a warm kitchen surrounded by love. She talked about the comfort foods that got her through sleepless nights after her divorce, the meals she cooked for her son when they were both grieving. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on her son, Wolfgang's music career, her fond memories of Eddie, and her hopes for the future. The audience was engaged, nodding along, connecting with every word. This was the interview everyone had expected. Warm, authentic, meaningful. Then Joy Behar leaned forward, and the energy in the room shifted in a way that made several people uncomfortable. There was something in her eyes that the other hosts recognized. That predatory gleam that meant she was about to go somewhere unexpected. So Valerie, Joy began, her voice carrying that familiar edge that regular viewers knew all too well. You've written quite a few cookbooks now. This must be what? Your 5th? 6th? Valerie nodded, still smiling, unaware of what was coming. This is my 6th, yes. Each one has been a different chapter of my life, I suppose. They've all reflected where I was emotionally at the time. Right, Joy continued, tapping her pen against her notes in a way that seemed almost theatrical. And each one seems to come with some new personal crisis that you're very publicly working through. Don't you think there's something a little calculated about that? Turn your trauma into a marketing opportunity. The question landed like a slap across the face. The audience went quiet. The other hosts exchanged glances that ranged from surprise to openly uncomfortable. Valerie's smile faltered, but only for a moment before she gathered herself. But in that moment, everyone in the studio saw the hurt flash across her face. I'm not sure I understand what you're asking, Joy, Valerie said carefully, her voice measured. These books are about sharing recipes and stories that have helped me. If they help someone else going through something similar, then I've done something meaningful. That's always been my intention. But Joy wasn't backing down. If anything, she seemed energized by the tension she'd created. She had that look in her eyes. The one that said she had decided before the interview even started exactly where she wanted this conversation to go, and nothing was going to deter her from that path. What I'm asking is whether all this oversharing isn't just a carefully constructed brand. The weight struggles you talk about constantly. The divorce you've made sure everyone knows every detail about. Even your grief over Eddie seems to pop up whenever you have something to promote. Doesn't that strike you as a bit convenient? The studio was so quiet now that the hum of the lights seemed deafening. Valerie's face had gone pale, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly that her knuckles were turning white. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried a weight that filled the entire studio. Joy, I lost the love of my life to cancer. I watched him deteriorate for years. I held his hand when he took his last breath. I was there when my son said goodbye to his father. If you think I would use that pain to sell cookbooks, then you fundamentally misunderstand who I am as a person. The words hung in the air, heavy with emotion and the kind of pain that couldn't be faked. But Joy inexplicably pressed forward. Something was driving her that went beyond normal interviewing. Something that looked almost personal. Oh, come on. You and Eddie were divorced for over a decade before he died. Let's not pretend this was some great love story that was cruelly interrupted. You'd both moved on. You'd both remarried. The tragic widow act seems a bit much, don't you think? Several audience members gasped audibly. Alyssa Farah Griffin looked like she wanted to disappear into her chair. Sarah Haynes had her hand over her mouth in visible shock. Even Sunny Holan, who was rarely caught off guard, seemed genuinely appalled by the direction the interview had taken. The producers in the control room were having urgent conversations about whether to cut to commercial. Valerie's eyes filled with tears, but there was something else there now, too. Something that looked a lot like anger rising beneath the hurt. Something that had been dormant for years, but was now waking up. You don't know anything about our relationship, Valerie said, her voice stronger now, steadier. Eddie and I may have been divorced on paper, but he was the father of my child. He was my best friend until the day he died. We talked every single day. We had dinner together regularly. Our family spent holidays together. Just because a marriage doesn't last forever doesn't mean the love ends. That's not how love works. Joy leaned back with what could only be described as a smirk, a satisfied expression that suggested she was pleased with the reaction she was getting. Well, that's a lovely story for the cameras, but the reality is that you've built an entire second career out of being the suffering celebrity. First, it was the weight struggles, then the difficult marriage, now the grief. What's next, Valerie? What's the next tragedy you're going to monetize? The accusation was so cruel, so deliberately designed to wound that for a moment, Valerie simply stared at Joy in disbelief. The kind of disbelief you experience when someone does something so unexpectedly awful that your brain can't quite process it. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to a dangerous calm that those who knew her well would recognize as the breaking point. You know what I find interesting, Joy? Valerie said, straightening in her chair. You've spent the last several minutes attacking my character, my grief, my motives for sharing my story. But you haven't asked me a single question about the actual content of my book. Not one recipe, not one story about healing. Nothing constructive at all. Joy waved her hand dismissively, as if Valerie's observation was beneath consideration. The cookbook stuff is promotional fluff. Anyone can write about recipes. I'm asking the real questions that journalists should be asking. Really, Valerie's voice was getting stronger, her composure returning as something harder took its place. Because what I'm hearing isn't journalism. What I'm hearing is cruelty for entertainment value. You're not trying to get at any truth. You're trying to make me cry on camera so you can have your viral moment. Is that what this show has become? The observation was so accurate that Joy actually flinched. Her confident expression flickered for just a moment, but she recovered quickly, her defensive instincts kicking in with practiced ease. I'm holding you accountable for the way you've commodified your personal struggles. Someone has to point out that this constant oversharing might be less about helping others and more about helping yourself. Someone has to ask these questions. Valerie leaned forward, and there was no more sadness in her eyes, only a fierce burning clarity that transformed her entire presence. The audience could see the change happening in real time. This wasn't the sweet actress from the sitcoms anymore. This was a woman who had been pushed too far. Accountable for what exactly? For being honest about my weight struggles when millions of women are shamed for their bodies every day. For talking openly about the pain of divorce when half of marriages end the same way. For grieving publicly when our culture tells women we're supposed to suffer in silence and never be a burden. She paused, letting those questions sink in before continuing. The studio was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. You want to know what accountability looks like, Joy? It looks like me sitting here right now refusing to let you make me feel ashamed for being human. It looks like me standing up and saying that your questions aren't journalism. They're cruelty, and I'm not going to participate in that anymore. Joy's face had gone red. Her voice was getting shriller. Well, I think you're being defensive because you know there's truth in what I'm saying. If your motives were pure, you wouldn't be so upset by legitimate questions. No, Valerie said firmly, her voice cutting through Joy's defensive protests. I'm upset because I came here in good faith to have a meaningful conversation about healing and resilience. And instead, I've been subjected to a character assassination by someone who apparently decided, before I even sat down, that I was a fraud. That's not journalism. That's a hit job. The studio was absolutely silent. Even the crew members had stopped moving, transfixed by what they were witnessing. This wasn't the Valerie Bertinelli the world knew. The sweet, gentle actress who cried on cooking shows and shared vulnerable moments on Instagram. This was someone who had been pushed too far and was finally pushing back with everything she had. Joy tried to regain control. Look, I'm simply pointing out patterns that other people have noticed, too. You can't blame me for asking the questions that are on everyone's mind. I'm giving voice to what people are thinking. Whose mind exactly? Valerie shot back. Because I don't see anyone in this audience nodding along with your cruelty. I don't see your co-hosts agreeing with your assessment of my character. The only person who seems convinced that I'm some kind of fraud is you. So maybe the question isn't about my motives. Maybe the question is about yours. The counterattack caught Joy completely off guard. Her mouth opened and closed several times before she found her voice. My motives are journalistic. Integrity. Someone has to ask the tough questions that others are afraid to ask. Tough questions. Valerie's laugh was sharp and bitter, a sound that seemed foreign coming from her. You haven't asked a single tough question. A tough question would be asking me how I cope with depression when it feels overwhelming. A tough question would be asking about the specific struggles of grief and how I've learned to move forward. A tough question would be asking about the real work of healing that goes into writing a book like this. What you've asked is designed to humiliate, not illuminate. There's a difference. Whoopi finally attempted to intervene. Maybe we should redirect this conversation to something more constructive. But Valerie wasn't finished. She had found her voice, and decades of being the nice girl, the polite guest, the accommodating celebrity were falling away like chains being shed. No, Whoopi. With all respect, I think this needs to be said. She turned back to Joy, her gaze unwavering. You know what the really sad part about all of this is, Joy? You had an opportunity today. You had an audience of women who are struggling with weight, with divorce, with grief, with all the things life throws at us. And you could have used this time to have a real conversation about healing, about resilience, about how we put ourselves back together after we've been broken. She paused, shaking her head slowly. Instead, you chose to tear someone down. You chose to question their motives, their grief, their right to share their story. And for what? A few minutes of controversy, a clip that might go viral. Is that really worth it to you? Joy's face was cycling through various shades of red. I'm not going to apologize for asking real questions instead of throwing softballs like everyone else. That's not who I am. Real questions. Valerie repeated the phrase like it tasted bad. Let me tell you about real questions, Joy. A real question is what a doctor asks when you've gained weight from depression and she wants to understand why. A real question is what your therapist asks when you're processing grief. A real question is what your son asks when he wants to know if you're going to be okay after his father dies. Those are real questions. What you've been asking is gossip with a journalistic costume on. The observation was devastating in its accuracy. Joy's smirk had completely disappeared, replaced by something that might have been shame if she were capable of showing it. But she wasn't done fighting. Well, Joy managed, her voice considerably less confident than it had been moments earlier. If you can't handle scrutiny, maybe you shouldn't be in the public eye. Valerie stood up slowly, her full height giving her presence in the studio that she hadn't had while seated. Her voice was calm, but carried a weight that silenced everyone. Scrutiny? This isn't scrutiny. This is meanness. There's a difference, and you know it. Scrutiny is asking hard questions about someone's work, their choices, their impact. Meanness is questioning whether someone's grief is genuine. Meanness is suggesting someone is profiting off their trauma. Meanness is what you've been doing for the last 15 minutes. She looked around at the other hosts, then at the audience, then back at Joy. I've been in this business for almost 50 years. I've done thousands of interviews, and I have never in all that time been treated with such deliberate cruelty by someone who claims to be a journalist. Joy tried one more time to salvage her position. I think you're being overly sensitive. These are legitimate questions about public figures and their motivations. You've chosen a public life. Overly sensitive. Valerie's laugh was hollow. That's what people always say when they've been cruel and don't want to take responsibility for it. They call the person they've hurt sensitive instead of examining their own behavior. But I'm not going to let you turn this around on me. I came here to talk about healing, and you turned it into an attack. That's not my failing. That's yours. She began gathering her things, her movements deliberate and dignified. Every person in that studio was watching, holding their breath. You know what I've learned in 65 years of life, Joy? I've learned that hurt people hurt people. I've learned that when someone attacks you unprovoked, it's usually because there's something inside them that's broken. And I've learned that you can't heal what you refuse to acknowledge. She looked at Joy with something that might have been pity. I don't know what's broken inside you that made you decide to come after me today, but I hope you find it and deal with it, because this isn't journalism. This isn't entertainment. This is just sad. Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Valerie held up her hand. No, we're done here. You've had your 15 minutes to tear me down. You've questioned my grief, my motives, my character. You've suggested that my pain is manufactured for profit, and now you want to have the last word. No, I don't think so. She turned to address the camera directly, her voice soft but unwavering. To anyone watching this who has ever been made to feel ashamed of their struggles, whether it's weight or divorce or grief or anything else, I want you to know something. Your pain is real. Your journey is valid, and you don't owe anyone an explanation for how you choose to heal. Don't let anyone, especially someone with a platform and an audience, make you feel like you're wrong for being human. The audience began to applaud, softly at first, then building to something significant. Valerie acknowledged them with a small nod before turning back to the hosts. Whoopi, Sarah, Sunny, Alyssa, thank you for having me. I'm sorry this didn't go the way anyone expected. She deliberately did not include Joy's name in her farewell. As she began to walk off the set, Joy made one final attempt to save face. Valerie, I think you're making this into something bigger than it needs to be. We were just having a conversation. Valerie stopped and turned back, her expression unreadable, but her eyes burning with quiet fire. No, Joy. I'm making it exactly as big as it is. You attacked a grieving woman on national television for no reason other than your own entertainment. You questioned whether my love for the father of my child was real. You suggested that my struggles with weight and depression are calculated marketing strategies. That's not something small. That's something that reveals exactly who you are. She held Joy's gaze for a long moment. The silence was deafening. And what you are, Joy, is someone who has confused cruelty with courage. You think being mean makes you smart. You think tearing people down makes you relevant. But all it really makes you is someone that people dread being in a room with. And that's the saddest thing of all. With that, she walked off the stage. The audience sat in stunned silence. The other hosts stared at their hands, at their notes, anywhere but at Joy, who was sitting alone at the table, looking like someone who had just realized they had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. What had started as a promotional interview for a cookbook had become something else entirely. A moment of reckoning. A demonstration of what happens when someone who has always been nice, always been accommodating, finally decides that enough is enough. And as the cameras continued to roll, capturing Joy Behar's isolated figure at that famous table, it was clear to everyone in that studio exactly who had come out on top. What do you think about this incredible confrontation? Was Joy Behar out of line, or was she just doing her job? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that will absolutely leave you speechless.